Brian grew up with his aunt and her family. His parents left him when he was a baby, so he never knew them. His aunt always blamed him for his parents running away with her money and made him work tirelessly to pay her back. Brian did everything his aunt asked without complaining, because he felt thankful she didn't abandon him like his parents did. During Brian's early teenage years, his aunt forced him to accompany wealthy men, both young and old, allowing them to do as they pleased with him. He was expected to fulfill their every request, and if he failed to satisfy a client, his aunt would harshly slap him, while his uncle would hit him continuously with anything he could find. These affluent men frequently took advantage of Brian, leaving him feeling powerless and alone. After enduring everything, all he could do was cry and cleanse himself vigorously in the shower, desperate to rid himself of the overwhelming sense of filth. Despite knowing what he goes through with those rich men, his aunt turned a blind eye. All she cared about was the money Brian brought in, which she used to pamper her daughter, Chloe. Chloe was constantly spending money without a care in the world. From a young age, she desired every good thing that Brian got, and her mother did not hesitate about taking it from him. Chloe would even falsely accuse Brian of wrongdoing and get him punished, even though she would face no punishment if she owned up to her actions. Since childhood, Brian rarely smiled because there was little in his life to bring him joy. He nearly forgot how to smile altogether until he encountered a client named Tony. Tony, only a couple of years older than Brian, treated him with respect and never pressured him into anything he disliked. Instead, Tony took Brian on enjoyable outings, looked after him, and shared corny jokes that weren't necessarily funny but still made Brian laugh. In Tony's company, Brian found solace from his troubles and enjoyed each moment they spent together. He felt happiest whenever Tony requested his company. One day, Tony asked Brian, "What if I don't want to be your client anymore?" Brian's heart sank, and his expression fell. Being with Tony was the only time he could smile and forget his troubles, and now that was slipping away. But then Tony continued, "I want us to have something more than that. I like you." Brian felt a surge of happiness hearing this, because he had developed feelings for Tony too, but he didn't think he was good enough for him. He replied, "I'm sorry, I can't have any personal relationship with a client. Your time is up, I'll leave now," and quickly turned away to hide the tears welling up in his eyes. Tony had no direct means of contacting Brian other than through his manager. He attempted to request Brian's personal contact information from the manager, but his request was denied. Tony also tried asking Brian directly, but Brian replied that he couldn't give out his personal contact information. Tony decided to visit the club where Brian worked without booking him in advance. Upon arrival, he witnessed several men ganging up on Brian and attempting to force themselves on him. Acting instinctively, Tony rushed to Brian's aid, swiftly intervening to pull the men off him and beating them up. After that, he pulled Brian outside. Upon reaching outside, Brian withdrew his hand from Tony's grip and questioned why Tony intervened. Tony then inquired, "Is this what you go through, doing this kind of job?" Brian curtly responded, "That's none of your business." Tony persisted, "Do you have to do this? Is it because of money? If you're uncomfortable taking my money, I can arrange a well-paying job for you so you don't have to do this anymore." Brian retorted, "I don't need money. I do this job because I enjoy it, and you just ruined my fun time." Tony expressed, "I know you're lying," but Brian insisted, "Please mind your own business. I hope to see you again. I can't afford to lose a VIP client like you." With that, Brian returned inside, already aware of what awaited him. As Tony left feeling frustrated that Brian didn't want to accept any help, Brian returned home to face his aunt and uncle. They subjected him to their usual punishment, hitting him repeatedly until they grew tired. They also asked him to go personally compensate those hurt client, obeying everything they asked him to do until they were satisfied. In the following weeks, Tony never showed up. A part of Brian longed to see Tony again, but another part dreaded it. Brian never wanted Tony to witness him in such a miserable and humiliating state, unsure of how he could face him now. With Tony's absence, Brian felt utterly miserable once more, unable to find a reason to smile. He was called to meet a VIP client, and upon arriving at the meeting place, he spotted Tony. Hiding his excitement, he approached Tony and remarked, I thought I lost my favorite VIP client. Tony admitted, I tried to stay away from you and not see you again, but I failed. I knew it wasn't possible, but I wanted to try. In the end, I truly couldn't do it. Brian stood silently for a moment before diverting the conversation, asking, Where would you like me to escort you today? Tony then inquired if Brian knew how to bake, to which Brian affirmed. Tony then asked him to help him bake a cake, and Brian replied, That's not part of my job, but I can help you since you're my VIP client. They headed to the mall to purchase ingredients for the cake, then proceeded to Tony's house. After playing around with the flour and nearly using it all up, they successfully managed to finish the cake. Brian did almost all of the work since Tony was clueless about what he was doing. Standing there covered in flour, Tony placed candles on the cake, lighting them up, and began to sing happy birthday to Brian. Brian was taken aback and overwhelmed, having never celebrated his birthday before and even forgotten his birthday. He blew out the candles, holding back tears, and jokingly said, You made me bake my own cake? Tony replied, Well, I didn't know how to bake it. They cut the cake. Brian asked Tony how he knew it was his birthday, and Tony revealed that he saw it on Brian's ID card. Some cream smeared on Brian's lips as he ate the cake. Tony gazed at his lips and then asked, Can I kiss you? Brian replied, You're my VIP client, so you can. Tony's expression changed. And as Brian leaned in for the kiss, Tony turned away, saying, Never mind, and can you please stop with this VIP client thing? Brian was left speechless, unsure of how to respond. Just then, he received a call from his aunt, asking him to come back immediately because he had to meet another client. Realizing he had spent more time than he should have with Tony, Brian quickly said, Thank you for today, before rushing out. In the following days, Tony and Brian grew even closer than before, even though they couldn't meet often. Tony arrived unannounced again at Brian's workplace and witnessed Brian being slapped by his aunt. He quickly rushed to Brian's side, asking why his manager had slapped him. Brian, covering his face in embarrassment, lamented, Why do you always see me in such embarrassing situations? Tony gently removed Brian's hand from his face and asked, concerned, What's going on? And why were you allowing your manager to slap you like that? Brian replied, She's my aunt, not my manager. Tony responded firmly, Still, that doesn't give her the right to treat you that way. Please tell me what's going on with you. I want to be someone you can lean on and share your happiness and sorrows with. Don't always keep everything to yourself. Brian always endured everything in silence, never considering opening up to anyone. He had never even had anyone to confide in, but now he has Tony. Overwhelmed by the need to release years of pent-up frustrations, Brian poured out his heart to Tony. Recounting all the hardships he had endured at the hands of his aunt and her family since childhood. Tears streamed down Brian's face as Tony listened attentively, his heart heavy with sadness and anger toward those who had hurt Brian. Concerned, Tony asked Brian why he continued to live with his aunt despite the abuse. Brian replied, They are the only family I have, and I feel like I owe them. Tony said, Family doesn't have to be someone you are related to. You don't owe them anything. If they truly saw you and loved you as family, they wouldn't treat you like this. Brian responded, Still, they are the only people I have. I'm already broken. Who will accept someone like me? Tony's eyes softened as he replied, Why would you say that? You don't know how precious you are, and I like you for who you are. Brian stood up abruptly and said, You can't like me. I don't even like myself. You deserve someone better. Then left. Brian's aunt, sensing something going on between Brian and Tony, took measures to prevent them from seeing each other. Days went by, and Tony couldn't get to see or speak to Brian. He frequented the club where Brian worked and visited Brian's residence. But Brian's aunt or cousin always intercepted him at the door, denying him access to Brian. On the other hand, Brian couldn't stop thinking about Tony's words. His feelings for Tony continued to deepen, motivating him to strive to become the person he believed Tony deserved. For the first time, Brian stood up for himself, refusing to tolerate clients who tried to exploit him. Brian mustered the courage to inform his aunt of his decision to quit his demeaning job and focus on pursuing a college education to obtain a better job. He explained his intention to pay off his parents' debts in full and also support them financially in the future. However, Brian didn't anticipate the reaction his aunt would have to his decision. She began hurling insults at him, telling him that even if he sold all his organs and ended his own life, he still wouldn't be able to pay off his debts. She insisted that someone like him didn't deserve to live a peaceful life and demanded that he stay with her and obey her every command. She then called his uncle to come and discipline him, ensuring he wouldn't consider leaving again. Bound and helpless, his uncle proceeded to deliver a brutal beating, more severe than any punishment he had ever received before. After being released, barely able to walk properly and feeling lifeless, Brian stumbled out, not shedding even a single tear. Without thinking, he dialed Tony's number from memory. As soon as he heard Tony's voice, tears began to flow uncontrollably, and without uttering a word, Brian abruptly ended the call. Tony heard the sobs on the other end of the line and instantly knew it was Brian. Without a moment's hesitation, he rushed out of his place, heading straight to Brian's house. Before he could reach the destination, he spotted Brian wandering on the street. Tony called out Brian's name as he walked towards him, and the moment Brian saw him, he rushed into Tony's arms, crying uncontrollably. Tony noticed the bruises on Brian and gently pushed him away, his expression turning angry as he demanded, "Who did this to you?" Brian remained silent, but Tony, who it was? He asked, his anger palpable. "Did those people do this to you?" With anger simmering within him, Tony began to head towards Brian's house, but Brian hastily pulled him back, saying, "You're going to cause more trouble for me." Frustrated and upset, Tony questioned, "You still want to go back to that house?" Before tears welled up in his eyes. Brian asked, "Why are you crying?" Tony replied, "Why do you have to be so stubborn? Can you please listen to me, just this once? I can't bear to see you hurt, and I don't want anyone to hurt you again." Brian hesitated before saying, "I can't just leave like that." Tony insisted firmly, "You can and you will. I don't care what else you have to say. You are coming with me. We are going to the hospital first for a full body checkup because I don't know what else those people have done to you. Then, we'll go to my house, where you'll be staying with me until I'm sure you won't come back to this place." Brian nodded in agreement, and they made their way to the hospital, where Brian underwent a thorough checkup and received treatment for his bruises. Apart from being a little malnourished, Brian was deemed to be in relatively good health. After leaving the hospital, they proceeded to Tony's house. Upon arrival, Brian looked around and remarked, "This is not your house. I've been to your house once, remember?" Tony explained, "This is where I've lived since I was born, with my parents and siblings. I only stayed at that other house because it was close to my workplace." Brian then hesitated, saying, "Your parents and siblings are in there? I'm not going. What would they think of me?" Tony reassured him, "You don't have to worry. I've already told them everything about you, literally everything. They already love you and can't wait to see you." Brian shook his head, not wanting to go, while Tony pulled him along. As they stepped inside, they were met by Tony's parents and siblings, who were eagerly waiting at the door. Brian was welcomed with bright smiles, and Bianca, Tony's little sister, eagerly hugged him. Not wanting to make Brian uncomfortable, Tony's family avoided discussing Brian's issues and instead invited him to come for dinner. Brian was surprised by the array of dishes on the table. Tony's mom explained that she had prepared a variety of dishes as she wasn't sure what Brian liked. She then asked Brian about his favorite food so she could make it for him next time. Overwhelmed, Brian replied that he could eat anything. As Brian ate with everyone, tears began to roll down his cheeks uncontrollably. Concerned, Tony's mom asked if the food was too spicy, but Brian quickly apologized, saying, "I'm sorry, it's just that I've always eaten alone, and it feels nice eating warm, delicious food with you guys." Tony's family immediately got up and surrounded Brian, enveloping him in a group hug. They assured him that he was now part of their family, and that they would always eat warm, delicious meals together. After dinner, Tony guided Brian to his room and helped him apply the prescribed ointment to his bruises, after his bath. Later, Tony had settled into bed when he heard a knock on the door. Opening it, he found Brian standing there, asking if he could sleep in Tony's room for the night. Tony led him in. As they lay in bed together, Brian asked, "Can you hug me?" Tony smiled and wrapped Brian in an embrace as they drifted off to sleep. As days passed, Brian gradually adjusted to his new family, experiencing love and care he had never known before. Tony was patient with him, waiting until Brian felt ready to start a relationship. The family were spending time together playing games when they heard loud bangs on the door. They wondered who it could be, since the person decided to bang on the door instead of using the doorbell. They curiously made their way to the door, with Tony's dad opening it. Brian's aunt stood at the door, her gaze bypassing the person who opened it, as she immediately fixed her eyes on Brian. She said, "So this is where you've been hiding. You thought I would never find you." Tony's dad intervened swiftly, ordering her to leave or he would call the police. Tony's mom stepped forward, addressing her with disdain, "So you're that witch of an aunt. We don't want to see you anywhere near our son, or else you won't want to know what we'll do to you." Brian's aunt scoffed dismissively, retorting, "You call that trash your son?" Tony asserted, "If there's any trash here, it's you. We don't want to waste our breath on you anymore, so leave." With that, he firmly shut the door in her face. The family turned their attention to Brian, concerned about how he might be affected by the sight of his auntie. To their surprise, Brian just wore a smile on his face. He expressed gratitude, remarking that no one had ever defended him like that before, and thanked them for accepting him. They felt relieved that Brian was okay and hugged him. Tony followed Brian to his room and asked if he wanted to consider taking legal action against his aunt and her family. Brian shook his head, expressing that it wasn't necessary, as they were still his family regardless of everything. Tony frowned, hearing Brian still call them his family. Brian, with a soft smile, gently massaged Tony's furrowed brows. "Don't worry," Brian said, "I won't ever go back. I just don't want to waste my time on them anymore." Tony replied, "Okay, but I won't listen to you if she comes bothering you again." Unexpectedly, Brian leaned in and planted a kiss on Tony's lips. Tony was momentarily shocked, but then he remarked, "That was too fast. Can you do it again?" Forgetting their conversation, Brian wrapped his arms around Tony's waist and leaned in once more, kissing him more slowly and intimately this time. After they kissed, Brian expressed, "Thank you for everything, for liking me and for being patient with me. I don't want to wait anymore. Will you be my boyfriend?" Tony's face lit up with a bright smile as he nodded eagerly, pulling Brian into a tight hug. "I love you," Tony said, and Brian replied, "I love you too." Tony pulled back, visibly shocked. Brian softly smiled, then kissed Tony on the lips and hugged him again. Brian decided to follow his dream of going to college and starting up his own business. He had been saving money secretly since he was young, because his aunt always took his earnings. He hid the money in his aunt's house, but now he couldn't go back to get it. When he told Tony about it, Tony's mom heard them. She gathered everyone and said they were all following Brian to get his money back. Brian was speechless. He still couldn't get used to the love Tony's family had been showing him since he came to the house. Together, they all set out to retrieve Brian's money. When they arrived, Brian's aunt and her family remained silent and unmoving. Confused, Brian approached the spot where he had hidden his money, only to discover it gone. Brian immediately rushed to confront his aunt, questioning if she had taken the money. In response, his aunt remarked, "I knew you'd return for that money. Did you truly believe you could outsmart me and hide it in my own home?" With tears welling in his eyes, Brian questioned, "What did I do wrong?" His aunt's response was cold, "You did nothing wrong. I simply don't like you. I hated seeing your face every day." Brian's tears now streaming, he choked out, "Then why did you take me in?" Her reply was, "Because it was expected of me to care for you after your parents died, being sisters with your mother, and I got money for taking care of you." Stunned, Brian interjected, "But you said my parents ran away with your money." Her response was callous, "Well, your mother did take everything I ever wanted, always pretending to be virtuous, stealing all the attention for herself." Brian's legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to his knees, prompting Tony to rush to his side. With a trembling voice, Brian addressed his aunt, "Despite everything you've done to me, I've always loved you as family. I thought maybe, deep down, there was still a bit of love for me, even if you displaced your anger about my parents onto me. But I was wrong. You never truly saw me as family, and you've lied to me my whole life. I hate you, and I want nothing more to do with any of you." With those words, he walked away, Tony and his family following close behind. Brian headed straight to the police station and reported his aunt and uncle, showing evidence of their involvement in various illegal activities and their abuse towards him since childhood. Located his parents' graves and visited them. He apologized for coming so late and tearfully questioned why they had left him alone in this world so early. Now that Brian had lost his saved money, he couldn't pay for college. He wanted to start doing jobs to be able to save up again, but Tony's parents stopped him. They insisted on paying his tuition, and Brian couldn't even refuse. He worked hard in college, excelled, and graduated with flying colors. Little by little, he was able to achieve his dream of starting up his own business, with Tony by his side. He moved out completely from Tony's house but still visited them every week. Despite having his own house and Brian's place being far from his workplace, Tony decided to move in with Brian. Even though they being together for years, they still behaved like a newly in love couple. Brian made sure to support Tony whenever he needed it, remembering how Tony had supported him in the past. Tony's love for Brian never faltered, but kept increasing every day.